mental health is highly correlated to our metabolic health. Constant eating results in what's called like energy toxicity. Simple carbohydrate restriction can reverse a lot of problems that people have. And that could be everything from overeating to prediabetes.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Menaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Dominic, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
Dominic, you've been involved in groundbreaking research in neuroscience, metabolic health, and even extreme environments like NASA missions. What inspired you to do the work that you do, and what have been some of your most fascinating discoveries?
Yeah, we've worked in a diverse array of fields in my research, mostly neuroscience. I was trained as a neuroscientist with a postdoctoral fellowship to understand extreme environments and mostly the undersea environment. So in the effort to develop new technologies to understand the undersea environment, I got the opportunity to investigate cells, tissues, animals, and humans, including myself, in extreme environments. So that research has been, a big fulcrum of my career, looking at, how people respond to extreme environments and even how a disease process like cancer can respond to high pressure oxygen. So in the effort to understand human physiology, we went down many different paths. And one of them was, looking at the undersea warfighter, but also the astronaut. And somewhere in between, we started studying cancer as a metabolic disease from some of the observations we made under hyperbaric oxygen conditions.
Absolutely fascinating. And I actually listened to your TED Talk, and I thought it was so insightful, and how you have basically evolved a lot of the research. And I was wondering if you can share some of those key insights that have emerged that you shared in your TED Talk, because I just thought it was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think with the TED Talk now, that was over 10 years ago, but we developed a hyperbaric microscope and to understand oxygen toxicity seizures, which is a limitation for hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which has 14 different FDA approved applications. So in the process of doing that, we discovered that we could develop a non-pharmacological anti-seizure approach, which is actually a ketogenic diet to prevent oxygen toxicity seizures, which manifests as a grand mal seizure, also a tonic-clonic seizure. So in the process of doing research, some of the really key insights that we sort of stumbled upon was that if you give the brain a source of energy that can enhance brain energy metabolism and also reduce oxidative stress, that the brain can continue to function normally under conditions that it would otherwise produce a seizure or dysregulate brain energy metabolism, cognition, and various aspects of neurological function. So we started studying ketogenic diets, and then we developed, tested, and published on exogenous ketone supplementation in the form of ketone esters and also exogenous ketone electrolyte salts and different formulations of such. And we've applied these technologies that we developed into, about a dozen different applications. And that research was funded by the military, but then has gone into a number of other research projects that include, projects funded by industry, by small foundations, by National Institutes of Health. So we have a range of different projects really focused on metabolic health and preserving and enhancing metabolic health, because that's sort of the root cause of the three major diseases that would kill us. That includes cardiovascular disease, of course, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So we have research projects like on all these different things. And I think, the core of what with the TEDx talk was that we can develop, food-based metabolic therapies and even supplements that sort of mimic our endogenous metabolites. And then we can, sort of have control over our own destiny as it pertains to our metabolic health, which is central to our mental health. Mental health is highly correlated to our metabolic health. So that's another theme that we're working on. And it's an emerging field in the sciences called metabolic psychiatry. And for example, if we go down the other end of the spectrum, ultra processed food is associated with a wide range of psychiatric disorders or the overconsumption of that. And that's relatively new science, like in the last 10 years. But it's linked to, the food that we eat dramatically impacts our metabolism and many functions associated with things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise think about, including our mood and our behavior and our overall mental health over time. So that's another theme, that has emerged out of that early research.
Amazing. I was wondering if for our listeners, we could dive deeper into the ketogenic diet, ketones, and if they have an interest in taking some of the early steps to safely incorporate such a diet into their lifestyles, where would they start?
Yeah, well, everybody, may do a dietary intervention or change of diet for different reasons. The main thrust of our research started out looking at the clinically accepted application of a ketogenic diet, which was for seizures, and then that expanded into different applications, which are emerging applications. It's not the standard of care per se, but it is a standard of care for some of the things that we study. So if the everyday listener just wants to gain some information about ketogenic diets, our website, ketonutrition.org, is a great website. We have a lot of articles written on there. I always have directed people to the first website that I found on ketogenic diets in 2008 or 9, the Charlie Foundation, which is an amazing foundation by Jim Abrams, and his son Charlie, suffered from drug-resistant epilepsy, and that inspired a movie that Meryl Streep was in called First Do No Harm, which I also watched as I was getting into this area of research, and then later connected with the clinicians at Johns Hopkins and many other clinicians that had ketogenic diet clinics and were treating actual patients. So surprisingly, I went through a nutrition science program in college, and I really wasn't taught about ketogenic therapies for that. Or I was basically, ketogenic diets were more or less looked down upon, and we weren't really taught the clinical significance of it because they were mostly marginalized, as kind of an esoteric or kind of fringe dietary therapy to only be used in extreme situations, because ketogenic diets are difficult to follow. And for pediatric population, it's relatively easier because the child will eat whatever the parent makes or what's in the formula bottle, right, for pediatric epilepsy. But for adults, I think the compliance is pretty low with following a ketogenic diet, for example, for adult epilepsy. So a big focus of our research was developing ketogenic technologies that would allow you to consume exogenous ketones. And then these can be used with or without a diet, because there are some situations where people are unwilling or unable to follow a ketogenic diet. And one of the disorders that we study is a fatty acid oxidation disorder. So a ketogenic diet could potentially quickly kill patients who have this. However, because they can't metabolize fat, exogenous ketones can reverse the cardiomyopathy and actually keep patients alive. So ketones are kind of water-soluble breakdown products of fat. But these patients, for example, they can't tolerate a ketogenic diet, but the standard of care is sodium beta hydroxybutyrate, which is, a ketone body that can be administered orally or IV. So we work with a lot of different, groups that have support rare disorders, and we look at the science and the application of different ketogenic therapies for these things.
Are you on a ketogenic diet? And maybe can you share with us
Yeah.
some of the key daily practices that you've implemented for yourself?
Yeah, in studying a ketogenic diet, I was curious about, what it felt like being on a ketogenic diet. And I reached out and bought a book by Dr. Eric Kossoff and the late John Freeman from Johns Hopkins, which was a very calculated ketogenic diet, the 4-to-1 ratio. And that's a diet that's, very high in fat and with marginal amounts of protein that's adequate and essentially no carbohydrates. And I followed this diet and realized that the ketogenic diet is very hard to follow. So I sort of acknowledged that it would be important to develop ways to make ketogenic diets easier to follow. So that's why, we focused a lot of time and effort into developing a whole portfolio of ketogenic technologies that can mimic and produce therapeutic ketosis. But over time, I kind of shifted to more of a modified ketogenic diet that's more liberal in protein and just have a level of carbohydrate restriction that produces a state of ketosis. So that varies depending upon, your activity level, your individual physiology. That can vary significantly and is quite different than, I want to make the statement that this is very, very different than a medical ketogenic diet, which needs like really careful gram level calculations with an electronic scale and very precise ratios of macronutrients to produce therapeutic ketosis. So it's a very calculated approach than the internet keto or whatever you call it, the non-clinical ketogenic diet. But simple carbohydrate restriction can reverse a lot of problems that people have. And that could be everything from overeating to, pre-diabetes to, just getting their weight under control, giving them more energy. So some level of carbohydrate restriction is probably therapeutic for the large majority of US population that is over consuming carbohydrates, especially in the context of a sedentary lifestyle. If you're an athlete and you're very, you're burning a lot of calories, you're probably okay with a high carb diet, but the large majority of the population are obese, they have type 2 diabetes, and they want to lose some weight. And simple carbohydrate restriction that's a non-ketogenic diet is probably all that's needed. But ketogenic therapies are extremely therapeutic in the context of different disorders. And I can kind of go down the list on, the different disorders that are being studied, for example, like on clinicaltrials.gov, for example, there's quite a few.
And I know beyond the ketogenic diet, you've also done a lot of research on fasting as a metabolic intervention. How can intermittent fasting benefit brain health and energy levels? And what's the optimal way for someone to start fasting if they want to try it?
Well, it depends on why you want to fast. So that's like an important question that people have. So intermittent fasting and fasting in general is a way to produce a caloric deficit, an energy deficit that can put your body into fasting ketosis. And that can be therapeutic for a wide range of, disorders. Eating within it's all in the scientific community, it's called time restricted eating or time restricted feeding. And that could simply mean eating at the least restrictive is eating within a 12-hour window. So, waking up at 6 and, eating shortly after and then stop eating at 6, in the evening and not, and surprisingly about 90% or more of the population, will eat within something like a 18 to 20-hour window. So they're essentially eating kind of all the time. And it's not really giving the body, the digestive system a break. And our body is kind of inundated with having to, enzymatically and mechanically break down food. And constant eating results in what's called like energy toxicity. And a large percent of the population probably have this energy toxicity, and simply doing time restricted feeding and creating a fasting window of even 12 hours, 14, 16 hours can improve glycemic control, insulin sensitivity, and inadvertently cause you to eat less food, which can be beneficial overall. It can create a caloric deficit that can help you sort of lose and maintain weight eating within that. It doesn't work for everybody, but it can be an effective way to eat. And then, some people just don't like to eat breakfast, right? And maybe have their first meal later in the day. So there's nothing magic to it. You could do it with a standard diet. You could do it with a processed food diet. You could do it with a ketogenic diet, but it's essentially eating within a certain window. And I think many of the benefits of a ketogenic diet can be further augmented by implementing ketogenic therapies with time-restricted feeding. And this is really a good tool for people who have weight to lose. However, if you are underweight, which is sometimes the case with ketogenic diet therapies, for example, in kids or cancer patients trying to maintain their weight due to things like cancer cachexia, age-related sarcopenia, or chemotherapy-induced muscle wasting. So you don't want to further initiate, or augment weight loss. So time-restricted feeding can be contraindicated in those conditions, in that situation. However, in patients that are at a higher BMI and have weight to lose, then that's another form of sort of, I don't like to call it restriction. Another thing that can be added to dietary therapies to help implement healthy weight loss over time. But eating, for example, one meal a day, which some people do, it may be okay for some people, but getting all the nutrition that you need in one meal per day is kind of a common trend. It would be hard to optimize your protein intake and protein metabolism by simply eating one meal a day. And I know that's a trend that a lot of people are doing. Super busy days, I may do that, but not every day. And I think some people have gone down that path. And I think what it ultimately results in is a loss in like muscle over time. And that could be potentially detrimental to your metabolic health, the muscle loss that's associated with only, eating one meal of protein per day, or one meal total.
Very interesting. I know also, a lot of the research has, that we read about, talks about chronic inflammation being a root cause of many health issues that we see in the population. I was curious if you can share with us, based on your research, what daily practices can we take in order to reduce inflammation?
Well, people have inflammation for different reasons. So it could be lack of exercise, inactivity. The main cause, I think, for inflammation is linked to our metabolic health. So simply improving metabolic biomarkers through exercise and nutrition is one way to achieve that. Elevating and maintaining your blood ketone levels have an anti-inflammation effect. So we've published on that before. And that could be achieved even with a standard diet with ketone supplementation, or something like medium chain triglycerides sold as MCT oil in the store. So therapeutic ketosis has an anti-inflammatory effect. But the biggest, root cause of inflammation is people that have insulin resistance and they're overweight. So dealing with that first is probably the most important thing. And I also consult with and talk with quite a few people that are athletes that are high level, fitness professionals even, that have inflammation, and they are the epitome of metabolic health, because if you define that as favorable body composition or VO2 max or strength, these people also can have chronic inflammation due to overexercise. And some of them may be working professionals, and they tend to just work out and do a lot of stressful physical things on the weekends, and they kind of pay for it for a couple of days after that. So, exercising and not allowing your body enough time to recover is sort of an important thing. If you're really into strength training, powerlifting, lifting heavy weights, or doing really hard runs and sprints, or even, aerobic activity, it's really important to take a rest day. Especially over time, muscle has an incredible ability to adapt to stress over time. Your central nervous system, not that much, but muscle is incredibly plastic and adaptable to stress. So that can happen. For example, if you engage in a resistance training program, you might be incredibly sore when you start, but ultimately, if you ramp up your training volume and frequency and weights over time, your muscles will adapt to that. But your central nervous system may not fully adapt to that, and can create a condition where your stress hormones are elevated, and that can kind of affect your sleep, and your sleep can really impact your ability to recover. So what we see in like athletes, for example, that overexercise, their heart rate variability is altered. They have high resting, heart rate at nighttime. Their sleep latency is decreased. They're not getting into like good deep sleep. So super important to, from an inflammation standpoint, that a big driver of inflammation nowadays is just lack of sleep with people. Like if you kind of restore good sleep, that can like really reduce your markers of inflammation, which could be measured there's a protein called C-reactive protein, or high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And if you miss a day of sleep, or you're chronically sleep deprived over 3 or 4 days and get blood work done, you'll see your high sensitivity C-reactive protein get high, for example. Or another thing for chronic inflammation too is gut permeability. So people who have, irritable bowel syndrome, or something like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, they tend to have high markers of systemic inflammation. So if your gut is kind of lacks the barrier function and there's high permeability in the gut, that can trigger an auto-inflammatory response that can lead to chronic inflammation in people. And that can be quickly reversed with dietary interventions like ketogenic diets, for example, or just eliminating, certain triggers. Certain foods can be triggers for altering your intestinal permeability. So that's another driver, I think, that people should look into and maybe do a food allergy test.
Wonderful. And since we're talking also about food, tell us your view on sugar and what sugar does to our bodies and our brains. And what is your recommendation when it comes to sugar intake?
Yeah, again, that really depends on the individual. Like, kids may get away with eating a lot of sugar, like as I did growing up. I ate candy, I ate Pop-Tarts, I ate bowls and bowls of sugary cereal, but I managed to be okay. I came out of that alive. However, we do have a childhood obesity problem, and this is intimately linked to the availability and access to and promotion of commercialization of these processed food. And that includes everything from sugar sweetened beverages to box cereals to snacks and candy bars and processed food. I'm not of the opinion that you have to eat single ingredient whole food meals, but processed food is probably the biggest problem, and sugar in processed food is the main driver for obesity. And consuming excess sugar is the root cause to diabetes and obesity, and eliminating sugar is probably not possible, but reducing sugar consumption is absolutely possible. It's a solvable problem. Addressing the sugar problem needs to come from top down and the bottom up. So there needs to be federal regulation and a reduction, for example, on subsidies for certain crops that are used to make high fructose corn syrup, for example. There needs to be a grassroots engagement of communities that kind of can educate the lay public about the dangers of sugar and ultra processed food. I think the low hanging fruit would be sugar sweetened beverages, like in schools and vending machines that have these energy drinks plus sugar. It's kind of a bad combination. Eliminating sugar sweetened beverages and reducing the amount of sugar in processed foods, and maybe coming up with an alternative. And one of the alternatives that we're actually doing research on is called allulose. So allulose is in certain products like RX sugar, for example. You can get that at like Walmart or Publix here. Candy bars, they have, brownie mix and things like that. So instead of sugar, which is sucrose, uses allulose, which is a natural sugar. It's found in kiwis, it's found in figs, it's found in raisins, and it's an epimer of fructose. And not to get too down into the science weeds, it's a form of sugar that tastes great and could actually be incorporated into a ketogenic diet, but it has no sugar response. If you measure your blood glucose, it actually will reduce your blood glucose. So it's a natural sugar that could be, for example, slowly worked into our food system to make ultra processed food far, far less dangerous. And it could, a natural sugar like allulose has sort of a satiety effect that things like, artificial sweeteners definitely don't have, like aspartame, sucralose, even stevia and monk fruit are very sweet, but they don't have the satiating effect of something like a natural sugar like allulose, which is a GLP-1 secretagogue or mimetic, which means that if you consume this sugar, it will release a hormone called, we all know Ozempic and GLP-1. It actually triggers the body's own release of GLP-1. And then that can actually produce an increase and can reduce our hunger drive. So we call that satiety. So an interesting thing about allulose too is that it's transported into cells via a specific transporter called the GLUT5, and this is very high in cancer cells. And if you grow certain cancer cells that have this GLUT5 transporter, and you grow the cancer cells in the presence of fructose, the cancer cells divide and they grow very fast. So allulose looks almost identical to fructose and it tastes sweet just like fructose. It's called an epimer. But if you try to grow the cancer cells with allulose, they stop growing. It kills them essentially. They stop proliferating. You get more cell death. So we have, available in nature, we have these natural sugars that are not processed. They're super low calories. So we eliminate most of them through they're processed in a way where we just excrete them through our urine, and they taste good. They have, the satiety effects. We can bake with them. So I'm very interested in understanding different plant-based compounds and different natural food ingredients that can be engineered into a personalized ketogenic diet to further enhance the palatability, tolerability, and therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet. Mm-hmm. So, and sugar is sort of very anti-ketogenic. So you bring up like sugar, the problems of sugar. Well, one thing is that it's anti-ketogenic, and your ketone production is proportional to your fat metabolism. So sugar has a very strong anti-fat burning effect, right? So allulose, on the other hand, tastes sweet. You can consume it, and it doesn't impact insulin or our blood glucose. And then our body can continue to make ketones. I actually get a little bit higher ketone production, like when I'm, taking an allulose, for example. So I'm very interested in, getting involved in different organizations. And one of them is Food Fight USA, which is Todd Wagner. He was Mark Cuban's business partner. I actually interviewed him for the Metabolic Link podcast, which is part of the Metabolic Health Summit. So Food Fight USA is an organization. It's got Arnold Schwarzenegger, Morgan Freeman, it's got different celebrities behind it. And the main thing is to really target ultra-processed food and how this is impacting health, especially in the United States, where in addition to sugar, there are many, many food additives that are allowed in the US that are not allowed in Europe. And many of these things are potentially carcinogenic, or what we call obesogenic, meaning that you can keep calories the same, but these food additives sort of change our metabolism in ways that enable us to add fat faster. So this is a problem that requires a very thoughtful solution because many of these ingredients have been let into our food chain through the generally recognized as safe loophole. It's called GRAS. And it was allowed, GRAS pathway was a loophole that allowed certain things to enter our food supply that can be beneficial, certain preservatives and additives that are safe, but it has also allowed many things that are not safe. So having an amendment to the GRAS loophole, I think, is important to eliminate. And there's people working on that.
Fascinating. I was curious to get your view on the absorption of apple cider vinegar. Some people are recommending that we take 1 or 2 tablespoons prior to ingesting carbs in order to reduce the glucose spikes that our bodies have. What are your views on that?
I'm a fan of apple cider vinegar. We don't actively research it, but I do advocate that people use it. And apple cider vinegar does reduce the postprandial glycemic excursion. That's what we say in science. The postprandial rise in glucose can be reduced if you consume apple cider vinegar with a meal, and and a lot of people ask, like, how does it do that? How does vinegar do that? People put out different reasons for apple cider vinegar having this effect, and I think it's pretty well documented. I think the simple thing is that whenever we consume a meal, the acidity of the meal and the mineral content, the sodium content, the fat content, the fiber, and also the acidity will delay gastric absorption. So that's the movement of the meal from the stomach into the duodenum through the pyloric sphincter, and then the movement of the food. What your body needs to do is that if you consume acid with the meal, that can actually help with the digestions and the hydrolysis of protein and things like that. But your body also needs to secrete a substance called a bicarb to neutralize the acid, and we have different chemoreceptors in our gut that sort of sense the pH level and the acidity. And what that will essentially do is sort of slow down the movement of food throughout our digestive system so we can absorb it a little bit better, but we do it at a reduced rate. So by delaying gastric absorption, the rate of glucose entry into the bloodstream is reduced. And this kind of happens with the GLP-1 drugs, the GLP-1 mimetics. So that can cause sort of gastric paralysis in a way that can prolong gastric emptying time. So I think apple cider vinegar has beneficial effects sort of as a nutrient for our microbiome, for glycemic control, and I think it can improve digestion just simply by actually increasing the acidity. People take antacids, and people take things called proton pump inhibitors. And these things can actually be pretty bad for our microbiome. They can increase H. pylori, which is associated with gastric cancers and things like that. So I'm not a fan of antacids. I'm not a fan of proton pump inhibitors, which is a class of drugs that's one of the most widely prescribed drugs, like Nexium, for example, and things like that. So apple cider vinegar kind of does the opposite.
As we're looking in the market, and there's so many various tools and devices that we can use to measure everything from glucose levels to ketones to metabolic health. Are there specific devices that you would recommend for someone that really is curious to learn more about all these specific metrics that we spoke about, and that do not necessarily require like a blood test where you have to go to the clinic and so on? What daily tools or devices can people incorporate in their lives if they really want to monitor more all these dimensions that we have spoken about that relate to metabolic health?
Yeah, a simple like blood glucometer would probably be the easiest thing to get. I mean, you can get that on Amazon for like $25. A simple device commercially available on Amazon, Walgreens, Walmart, most stores have it. And it with a finger prick, it measures your blood glucose levels, and you want to know your fasting blood glucose. If you've measured it, 2 times your fasting blood glucose, if you measure twice and you're above 126 milligrams per deciliter, you are technically have diabetes. Or if you're around that, like pre-diabetes. So it's really important to know your fasting blood glucose, which may or may not be, something that the average person is doing even on a yearly basis. But I've done health screens where we go into communities and people light up and I measure their glucose levels. And I've measured glucose levels in kids that were fasting. That was some adults, 300, 400, they had no idea. And that level of glucose is extremely toxic to your kidneys, to your cardiovascular system. It sets you up for a whole host of disease process. So just simply knowing your blood glucose level is really important, but also knowing your postprandial glucose level in response to a meal. So eat a meal that you normally eat, whether that's a bowl of Cheerios for breakfast or, whatever sandwich you have for lunch, and then measure 30 minutes and 60 minutes and then maybe 2 hours after the meal. And if your glucose level goes from like 90 to 200, that's a sign that you have carbohydrate intolerance, that you need to reduce the amount of carbohydrates in your meal. So simply, for most people, they would probably do fine reducing added sugar and reducing the amount of starch that they're consuming and replacing starch with fibrous vegetables, not completely, but maybe 50%. That's a good direction to go in. But a simple glucometer is really important. I'm an advisor for Levels Health, which is an app-based system that uses a continuous glucose monitor that goes like on the back of your arm. And that could be a monitor from Abbott or Dexcom. And that CGM data goes into an app and it gives you actionable insights into how food affects your body, so and your metabolism. And from that information, you can adjust the type of food, the amount of food, and your activity level to optimize your blood glucose. And what that does is it has a profound effect on your energy levels, on your sleep. It gives you insight into really, it's like the most important biomarker for metabolic health. So a simple glucometer, continuous glucose monitor is also something that you can consider. And I also advise people to get blood work at the very least once a year, but usually like even twice a year or quarterly if you're really into it. And that blood work should be a comprehensive metabolic panel, a CMP, comprehensive blood panel or count, CBC, and also metabolic biomarkers like hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulin, triglycerides, HDL, LDL, and add HSCRP. While you're at it, you could look at your blood levels of vitamin D and magnesium. So these are all, everything I just mentioned there should be done like once per year. And sometimes if you ask your doctor, they can include it for free. If you say you have diabetes in the family, for example, so you can get some of these cardiometabolic biomarkers added to your just normal checkup. And I think that that's really important. Oh, and I forgot, like blood pressure is probably also is a silent killer, right? So a lot of people don't know their blood pressure. And I think that would be like a really important number to know. And the sooner you start tracking these things, the better. And then you do it longitudinally over time. So, and you can see, how you age. I have blood work going back to my teens, actually. So I can pull that data out and then look how my 20s, 30s, 40s, upwards to 50 now. So I can look to see, how that changed over the decades. And that information, when you get like my age, becomes really interesting to see how things change over time. Even things like kidney function, it's important. So to know these things, and also to maybe do what's called body composition testing with like an in-body device, which is like $30, or a DEXA scan, especially for women, to do like a yearly DEXA scan, which will measure your bone density, but also your body composition, your muscle weight, your fat weight, and just do that once a year. And then it gives you a goal to say, okay, I'm not going to lose any muscle this year. So next year when I go back, I'm going to, try to keep the same amount of muscle and reduce like my body fat. That's sort of what I do. And it's like $50 to $100 per year. That's not cheap, but it's not, doing it once a year, it's not that expensive.
Wonderful. And I was curious to know if there was a question about human health, longevity, or performance that keeps you up at night. Is there one mystery or challenge that you're most eager to solve next?
Metabolic health is the topic of my research, but I actually think, and this gets into your realm, mental health, I think is probably the most important thing. I think our health is, people get so involved in their careers. I'm no exception, right? Like I can be addicted to work. And if my wife did not pull me away from my work, it could probably destroy me, especially for a lot of people like in their 30s and 40s. They're just, and they're working professional, so they can overwork themselves. And I think it's the most important thing that keeps me up at night, because it literally will if I don't take creative downtime every day. So I have to have non-negotiable creative downtime of like 60 minutes or more, where I go for a walk with my wife and the dogs. I think a lot of people talk about biohacking. I think the biggest biohack that you could get is having a pet. We have 2 dogs, and it's a non-negotiable walk twice per day, but also like the emotional support, they even impact your microbiome. There's a lot of benefits. So, but the thing that would keep me up at night if I didn't do it is just, creating that and setting aside, I call it creative downtime. It's just, you get away from work and you're doing something completely different than work. For us, it's out. We live on a farm out in nature. So just getting outside, and nature is very therapeutic. So I think that's kind of like the most important thing. And then you're also, if you do it with someone that you love and your partner, you're building relationships, you're improving your health, and just, restoring your mental sanity.
Wonderful. So on this topic, actually, how do you define success and joy?
Well, I think it's difficult to have balance, but to have flexibility in your lifestyle that really kind of hits on, the major parameters, which prioritize our health as our greatest asset, along with relationships. I would say they're equal for number one. So prioritize your health, prioritize your relationships. That should come second to your career, which should maybe be third or whatever. And then really, I think, and this kind of gets into like things I think you talk about defining your purpose, right? For me, joy is, relationships and health, but also your career. If your career is intimately linked to the important questions, you don't want to go 30 years. You don't want to focus your career 30 years trying to, 30 years goes by and you realize that you're trying to answer the wrong question. When I stumbled upon Thomas Seyfried's work, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, I realized that this was a bit of a distraction from what I was funded to do, but this was such an important question that actually provided more purpose to my academic life and sort of meaning to study this fundamentally, motivated me. And that brought me a lot of joy, for example. So I'm just throwing out that example that my career took a change from doing pharmaceutical-based research to diet and metabolism-based research by realizing that this was a super important application of the fundamental understanding of metabolism, applying it to cancer therapy and cancer prevention. So yeah, creating that purpose, I think, is, part of the joy process. But you have to take time to smell the roses and create creative downtime too. So, but
Indeed,
it's all
it's so
part of it.
important. Any final points, Dominic, that you may wish to share with our audience as they walk away, based on everything you have shared? Any final tips on living more joyfully and basically maintaining both the physical and the mental health at its optimal levels?
Yeah, I think I would just, restate some of what I did. Like, you don't want to get so involved in your career and as an entrepreneur, whatever work you're doing, like, your audience, knows what they do. There's probably a vast array of different professionals out there, but you want to, and I think this is where planning comes in. I've always been really big with journaling and to be honest with yourself and to be sort of transparent also with your partner. And I think it's really important to have an accountability partner because some of us, we have addictions. You could be addicted to work. You could be addicted to food. You could be addicted to technology, social media. One way to create joy is to kind of break down those barriers and have, an accountability partner or a friend that kind of keeps you on track for doing the things that should be bringing joy to your life, prioritizing your health and relationships. So I think if you prioritize your health and relationship and seek questions within your career to answer the big questions, the meaningful questions, I think that will kind of help you kind of overall, right? If you're a leader or you're training people under you, you want to train people to adopt those same sort of ideas too. And then, anyone that we hire in our lab has to be, I call it like limbically motivated. Like your limbic system is sort of like, that emotional drive. So when I interview people, they have to have this foundation of passion and knowledge where they're just like so emotional about the topic. And sometimes it's because maybe people in their family had a particular disorder, cancer, whatever. So they really are inspired to make a difference. I think that's really important in choosing your career. Like pick something that you're like at a gut level, very motivated to do. And I think some people just go down the wrong path because maybe their family wants them to go down that path, or it's easy for them to, they're taking the easy route. But I think it's super important. You don't want to, like I said, you don't want to go 30 years down the road and say, I'm pursuing like the wrong questions. I should have, this is more fundamentally more important. I should have studied this or that. And you can course correct as you go, right? So I went down many paths during my early years, especially in college, and realized I was going down the wrong path, and then took, had to go back and made many mistakes along the way. And that's a learning process. So not saying don't make mistakes. I'm saying, be thoughtful about, the big decisions career wise. It's really important.
Fully agree. So, on these beautiful words, Dominic, it's been an immense pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for your time and all the wisdom you have shared.
Thank you, Andrea. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invitation again.